continue with our topic for today, and this is penetration testing. So this is the last topic for this ComSci 191 class cybersecurity. The purpose of this is, of course, to somehow give you an idea on a legitimate way to perform hacking activities. And this is done in the form of penetration testing. So this lecture video is, the content of this material is based on this book, Kali Linux, Assuring Security by Penetration Testing. So introduction. So what is a penetration? What is penetration testing, or shorthand is pen test? The process followed to conduct an in-depth security assessment or audit. So in an organization, for example, you have IT assets and you have an ICT infrastructure, and you would like to assess whether the infrastructure, the data is protected inside your organization. We also define the term methodology, which defines a set of rules, practices, and procedures that are pursued and implemented during the course of any information security audit program. So before you engage, or before anyone engages in a penetration test, he has or she has to follow a certain methodology, which has basically a set of rules. Okay? And then the pen test methodology defines a roadmap with practical ideas and proven practices that can be followed to assess the true security posture of a network, an application, system, or any combination thereof. So take note here that penetration testing methodology does not only pertain to systems. It can also pertain to, it can also target networks, applications, okay, and a combination of these, or the overall ICT infrastructure or ICT asset of an organization. The pen test can be carried out independently or as a part of an IT security risk management process. So in an organization, in a company, let's say banks, for example, universities, it's possible that a pen test can be outsourced. Okay? You have an external company doing the pen test, or it can be part of an internal risk management in the organization. So in the case, for example, of UPLB, we have a limited resource for doing pen tests. Then UPLB can outsource the pen test. Pen test is considered to be the last and most aggressive form of security assessment. Why is this called the last and most aggressive? There is another assessment called vulnerability assessment, or VA. So vulnerability assessment, we should discuss later the difference between pen test and VA. VA is somewhat limited, but pen test is somehow a more in-depth, okay, more aggressive form of security assessment. And it must be conducted by qualified professionals with or without prior knowledge of the targeted network or application. So usually you have companies that specializes in penetration testing. And of course, the final output will be a documentation, it's a report that is divided into several sections that describes how the pen test was performed and whether the objectives set during the penetration test was achieved. Now let's move on to the types of penetration testing. So from software engineering, you know already the word testing. So this one has something to do with security. So it's called penetration testing. And the categories for testing, or the type of testing that applies to software engineering, also applies to penetration testing. The first one is called the black box testing. What is this black box penetration testing? Here, the security auditor or the pen tester, usually a lot more than one, will not be aware of any internal technologies deployed by the targeted organization. So totally, not totally no information, but just limited information is available for the pen tester or the auditor. And it actually employs a real world hacker techniques, because a hacker usually does not have an idea of the internal technologies, the network topology inside an organization. So initially, the attacker will have no information about the target organization. It's important for the pen tester to understand, classify, and prioritize the vulnerabilities according to the risk level. So during the course of the engagement, the pen tester will be able to identify vulnerabilities and actually exploit these vulnerabilities. And then these vulnerabilities will have to be categorized according to risk. For example, a data breach, a possibility of a data breach when a vulnerability is exploited has a very high risk. And it is ideal to identify all the attack vectors that could cause the target to be compromised. Okay, so that's black box testing, pen testing. The next one, of course, is the white box testing. So in this type of penetration testing, the auditor is aware of all internal and underlying technologies used by the target environment. So usually the auditor is given enough complete documentation of a list of assets, a list of diagrams, right, that he or she can use to perform the penetration test. It brings more value since it will eliminate any internal security issues in the target's environment. Because unlike in the black box pen test, it might be the case that the pen tester might unintentionally access a prohibited area of the network, which is not within the scope of the network. So that's black box testing. But if we have white box pen testing, you are given all the documentation that you need for the scope of your work. Anything outside the scope or the documentation presented to you is illegal. Okay, so that's the idea of this item here. And the time, cost, and knowledge level required to find and resolve vulnerabilities is less than the black box because the auditor already has the initial information needed to perform the penetration testing. So this one is the difference between vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. It says here that vulnerability assessment assesses the internal and external security controls by identifying the threats that pose serious exposure to the organization's assets. So the keyword here is you stop once you have identified the vulnerabilities in the target organization. So you can do that automatically. You have tools like Nessus and other vulnerability scanners that will tell you whether a particular asset is vulnerable or not. So once you've done that, you're done with vulnerability assessment. And this is actually automated. Okay? Now, pen test goes beyond identifying vulnerabilities and hooks into the process of exploitation, privilege escalation, and maintaining access to the target systems. If you attended the lecture on the MITRE attack framework, okay, wherein that framework discusses the different approaches of threat actors when they target an organization. So essentially, the steps there are included in the penetration testing because you try to see in penetration testing, you try to simulate the mindset of a threat actor or the attacker. So you go beyond identifying vulnerabilities. You identify a vulnerability, you exploit that vulnerability and do other stuff that a normal threat actor or hacker will actually do. And pen test is actually more intrusive than vulnerability assessment because you have to actually exploit the vulnerabilities and gain access to the IT resources of the target organization. So, as mentioned earlier, there has to be some form of formal, not actually formal, but a documented way of doing penetration testing. And this is where security testing methodologies come in. So one can strategically accomplish the time-critical and challenging task of accessing system security regardless of its size and complexity. So what we do here is to formalize methodologies which allows the execution of different types of tests step by step to judge the security accurately. So normally there are playbooks that are being used to perform penetration testing. Actually, threat actors, gangs, ransomware gangs, for example, they do have these playbooks or methodology. But for pen testing, we have this a list here of some of the existing methodologies used by companies that provide penetration testing services, like the Open Source Security Testing Methodology Manual, Information System Security Assessment Framework, OWASP, for penetration testing for the pen test of web applications, and other methodologies. Actually, the NIST also has its own testing methodology, standard testing methodology. So let's, okay, so despite having a lot of pen testing methodologies, we can actually, the textbook, the book reference in this presentation was able to come up with a general set or general list of items that comprises what they call the general penetration testing framework. So despite having different methodologies, all of the items can be common to those different methodologies are these items, general frameworks. We have target scoping, information gathering, target discovery, enumerating target, vulnerability mapping, social engineering exploitation, privilege escalation, maintaining access, and lastly, documentation and reporting. So we're going to discuss each of these steps. So the idea here is if you apply, if you are working in a pen test company and a client approach you to perform penetration testing on their network, for example, or on their application, you can follow these steps. Even bug bounty hunters for web application testing actually follow this type of this set of steps. So the first one is target scoping. So a company, let's say UPLB, approached you. Okay, can you do a pen test of our network here in UPLB? Okay, so before that can be done, if you're the pen tester, you have to agree on some terms on how the pen testing will happen. For example, you need to agree on what should be tested. Basically, you try to scope or to provide a scope, the coverage of your pen test. How should it be tested? Should you use white box? Should you use black box? What conditions should be applied during the test process? Are there specific limitations that must be that is present in your network? Okay. What will limit the execution of the test process? Will the pen tester be subjected to legal matters when he accidentally accessed an information that must not be accessed? How long will it take to complete the test? So this will require also, of course, pen test is not perpetual. Right? So you have to define, let's say, for 1 month, you're going to do the penetration testing and then come up with a report after that. Okay? Then what business objectives will be achieved? For example, you just want to be able to guarantee that the data provided by the users of your application, if you're doing an application penetration testing, is safe and the possibility of the data being leaked is minimal. Right? So that is target scoping. So once you, the pen tester and the client, have agreed on these terms, on the scope of your pen test engagement, it's time to do some information gathering. For example, okay, you've agreed that UPLB will do, you as the pen tester, you've agreed that you're going to perform black box pen tests. So meaning there is no information that is provided to you by UPLB. Right? So you need to gather information if you're going to start. When you start doing the pen test, you can have access to forums, bulletin boards, news groups, articles, blogs, social networks, commercial or non-commercial websites that is related to UPLB. For example, you can look at the UPLB website. You can look at the LinkedIn profile of the UPLB. You can go to the social network, to the social media accounts of UPLB, like the one in Facebook or in Twitter, right? So you need to gather information. And of course, the most important one is the domain name of UPLB, which is uplb.edu.ph. So most pen tests will start with that domain name, for example, uplb.edu.ph. So given this domain name, what assets can we access, right? So after information gathering, we have target discovery. So it deals with identifying the target's network status, operating system, and relative network architecture. Now, in the information gathering stage, there are actually tools that you can use to do that. An example would be AMASS, AMASS, right? Wherein you plug in the domain name, then you get a list of hosts that are associated with a particular domain name. So you can try to explore that later. Now, in the target discovery, right, this is how you try to profile the assets in the target organization. So you can identify, for example, what firewall is being used by UPLB, what router is being used by UPLB, what OS is being used by the servers of UPLB, what CMS is being used by websites in UPLB. There are tools that you can use to access, to do this target discovery. Okay? So after target discovery, you do some target enumeration. So you try to find open ports on target system. So this has something to do with networking. So I hope you've taken from say 1 to 7 already. So in a given host, there will be ports that are open. And as a pen tester, you have to be able to find what these ports are, right? And we have tools like for port scanning, like Nmap, which we will show later. And this will allow, Nmap is a tool that allows you to check for open ports in a system. I use this often to monitor hosts and servers and entire networks, right? And serves as a base for finding vulnerabilities in various network devices. So we have a short walkthrough later on how this is done. Then once you have identified the ports in a target system, you have to identify and analyze the vulnerabilities based on the ports that you discovered, right? This can be done manually or this can be automated. For example, if you have port 80, you discovered port 80. So port 80, I should know, is a web port or HTTP port. So that means there is a web server on that particular port, and you can go to the browser and check the site running on that port. Right? So you try to identify what web server is running on this port 80. You can, since this is port 80, you can check whether it's running Apache or it is running Nginx or it is running Node.js, right? Port 80. So, and then once you've identified the versions of the server software, you can try to identify or look for vulnerabilities affecting these systems, right? And this can be done automatically or manually. But in my case, for example, I usually do this manually. Okay. So in case, what if you cannot find any vulnerability on the running services of the target organization? So what do you do? Right? So you can do some social engineering activities. These are useful when no open ports are available. So you perform a port scan on the entire subnetwork, then or the entire network, or on the entire IP block of the autonomous system, and then you didn't find any useful port. So how do you try to gain access to the system? So you can do some social engineering. For example, you can send some phishing email, and then some phishing email will contain a malicious document, for example, that will load a remote access tool, shell access, and that can be done also. For example, you can send a PDF that contains a shell a code that downloads a remote access tool, right? Or a Word document that contains macros, right? So that's one thing. Another probably is leaving some USB disk, right, near the target organization, so that when an employee picks up that particular USB drive and inserts that drive on his machine, right? So that machine will be infected by a malware created by the pen tester, right? So there are very ways to, we call this initial access, gaining initial access to the system. Then after that, once you've identified the map or map the vulnerabilities, you can perform the actual exploit. So this is similar to the your lab in buffer overflow, wherein you have a vulnerable program, vulnerable to buffer overflow. Then you send a payload, right, to that particular vulnerable program that will exploit the vulnerability. So this may require additional research or modification of existing exploits, and it targets three areas: pre-exploitation, the actual exploitation, and post-exploitation. So let's say you have port 80 and you say port 80 and you have Apache web server, and the target host is using an old version of Apache web server. So what the pen tester can do is to send a request, special crafted request, to that particular web server that will trigger the vulnerability. And then once the vulnerability is triggered, the pen tester can send a payload that will execute a reverse shell. Okay. So that's exploitation. And after that, the pen tester already has access to the target system. Okay. So that's exploitation. So the idea is we're in. So that's the success, the initial success of the pen tester. Okay. So you can put that in your report. Then it's also possible, for example, that once the pen tester has accessed the system, he may have limited privileges, meaning he's just an ordinary user, so he cannot do much on the target system. So the next step for the pen tester is to perform what is called the privilege escalation, meaning from an ordinary user on the target system, you will become an administrator or the root user. And there are a lot of techniques on how to do that. These are actually there are a lot of research going on how to become the admin user or the root user of a target host, right? For example, on Windows, on Linux, example. So the idea is, of course, you want to have root access so that you can do more things than the ordinary user. So there are a lot of things that can be done, like to do that, exploiting vulnerabilities, sniffing network traffic so that you can get the packets, review the packets that are happening or that are moving around the network. Can download credentials and crack passwords, and then apply local network spoofing techniques to be able to, for example, to harvest credentials, right? So that's privilege escalation. And then lastly, once you have become root. So the idea here is once you become root, it's game over. Right? So you have fully compromised the system, but as a pen tester, you don't just stop there. Right? So later on, you might want to show to the organization team that you have indeed successfully broken into their system. So you have to perform some maintaining access, or actually it's called persistence method, so that later on, as a pen tester, you can still go back to the target system. However, this should be within the scope that you agreed upon with your client, right? Because it may be the case that the organization or your client does not want to have this maintaining access. So the client would just like to show us that you can gain root access to the system, period. So no maintaining access. But there are techniques called persistence techniques that will allow you as the pen tester to go back to your target machine. Okay, so there, for example, you can use registry. Okay, you can use passwordless login, SSH login, which I will illustrate later. So that's maintaining access. So the last step is documentation and reporting. So here, you have to come up with a report that summarizes and details what you did during the engagement. So it concludes the penetration testing activities. It concerned managerial and technical team can inspect the method of penetration and try to close any security holes that may exist. So the fact that you as a pen tester was able to go inside the system, then the organization will now have information on how to prevent that from happening for in case actual attackers actually perform the attack on your system. Okay. So reports can serve the purpose of capturing and comparing the target system's integrity before and after the penetration process. So in the case of that application, if you as the pen tester was able to exfiltrate the database, right, of the application, get all the contents of the data of the application, then you have to the organization will have an idea on how to prevent that from happening. Right? So that's one. And here's an example penetration test report. This is a theoretical or hypothetical penetration testing report from offensive security. So basically, it's a formal document, okay? Because of course, when you perform a pen test engagement, there should be a legal and formal way of presenting your ideas or presenting your results. So first, you have here the executive summary. So the target reader of the executive summary are managerial staff. Okay, so the managerial, the big bosses. Okay, so let's say in case of UPLB, the chancellor, the vice chancellor for planning and development, and the ITC director. So they will just be interested in the executive summary, not the actual technical details. So when you read this document, this executive summary section of the pen test report, you will notice that there is not much technical information in this section. So what it shows here is the goal of the pen test. So it has two main goals, and the second one has two sub goals. Right? So these are the goals of the pen test, and then also some description on how the pen test team perform the test. So they can highlight in this executive summary what methodology did they use. So in the case of this hypothetical pen test report, they use the NIST SP 800-115 standard. Right? Now, after the executive summary, we also have a summary of results. So this one is a bit more technical, the target here are the technical team, right? So just for the technical team to have a general overview of how the pen test was successful. It highlights some of the steps taken in high level terms, right? So you can see that the initial reconnaissance of the network, one network, resulted in the discovery of a misconfigured DNS server. So it all started with a DNS server that allowed a DNS zone transfer, right? The results provided us with a listing of specific hosts to target for this assessment. So they were able to access a DNS server, and when that DNS server was performing zone transfer, it was able, the pen tester were able to identify the hosts, right? The IP address, the host name of certain servers. And then they examine these hosts, etc., etc. But basically, you get the idea of general steps taken in order to perform the pen test, right? Then, so yeah, until the full compromise, right? And this one, so after the summary, you have the detailed step-by-step, the detailed documentation of the step-by-step process, reproducible, right? So the keyword here is reproducible, meaning after the report has been turned over to the organization's internal security team or IT team, they should be able to follow the documentation and verify that indeed these vulnerabilities are exploitable by just reading the submitted report by the pen tester. Right? So here you see an example of how the pen test team performed a brute force attack on the target to gain access to the credentials of a web portal. So basically, this is our technical details. So the report that you submit in this class from Sci 191 basically is similar to this, the step-by-step process that you did to be able to perform the activity. So in a way, what we're asking you to do is basically practicing how to write penetration testing report, like this one. Okay. So yeah. So those okay. So the next one is ethics. No? So penetration testing, as I said earlier, is the legal way of, if you are interested in hacking or breaking into systems, the legal way of doing this stuff. So it has some form of ethics or code, ethical code. So first, offering testing services after breaking into target system before making any formal agreement is forbidden. So let's say you did some pen testing without, actually illegal, without the organization knowing it. That's already illegal. And then you try to offer pen testing services. So that's not right. Okay. Second one, performing a test beyond the scope of testing and crossing identified boundaries without permission is prohibited. So in the earlier part of the engagement, we have target scoping. So if you go beyond what is in that, beyond the scope, then that is not the right thing to do. In binding a legal contract that should limit the liability of a job unless any illegal activity is detected, and there should be a duration. So you cannot say that after 1 month the engagement, and then the next month you still perform a pen test. That is illegal. And of course, this one, test process requires the set of steps required to be followed during the test. So it should have a methodology. And then lastly, the report must be clear and consistent. Okay, so that ends the discussion on the theoretical aspect. Do you have a question on this topic? None? Okay, so we can proceed to the walkthrough. Okay, so this one, will illustrate how you're going to perform a penetration test on a target host, assuming that you've done the scoping and you've done target enumeration. So in this practical activity, we're going to use three items. First, you need to have VirtualBox. Then you have Kali Linux. So Kali Linux is a go-to Linux distribution uh, for this penetration testing, right? And we have the target host, which is the vulnerable seed labs VM. Right? It's an Ubuntu VM. So I will not be doing live demonstration, but I will show you the step, but probably show some live demo later, but not for the entire thing. So let's start with this one. So the configuration. So here in my setup, in my VBox, I have the Kali Linux here, and I have a vulnerable machine here. And the main requirement for this practical walkthrough is that they should be both on the same NAT network, right? So they should be able to see each other and they should be able to connect to the internet, right? So these are the settings that you need to configure for this particular walkthrough. So the first, after booting up, so you need to boot up these two machines simultaneously, not simultaneously, but they should be both up running on VirtualBox. So you have Kali and Labs VM. Now this is my Kali box, right? This is actually the one I use for teaching this class. And after booting this, I see this IP address here. So 10.0.2.5/24. This is the IP address of my machine. Right? Now, the next step is to perform a port scan. I mentioned earlier that we can use the Nmap tool to check host in the network. So for example, I have this command here, nmap 10.0.2.0/24. Since you've taken ComSci 137 already, you know subnetting. So this means that it will try to check the hosts that are up within this subnetwork. So this will be 24/24. That means it will scan, it will check whether networks IP addresses from 10.0.2.0 to 10.0.2.255, actually 0.1 to 254 are up, right? And this IP range belongs to the NAT network. So as you can see here in this output, we have the Nmap scan report for 10.02.5. So this is the Nmap for the Kali box. And then it also has another result, which is 10.0.2.50. And if you guess it right, this will be that 15 will be the IP address of this target VM, right? Right. So there are two hosts that belong to this particular. This is actually the NAT network, right? And this is the IP address of the Kali box, and this is the IP address of our target machine, okay? And as you can see, there are a few services already that are shown here. For example, this machine has an FTP server, an SSH server, a telnet server, a DNS resolver, a web, and a proxy. Right? So, okay. So in this way, we were able to identify our target system by just doing a port scan. Right? Then the next one is we would like to. This is the first step in vulnerability mapping. Like in this previous scan, which is just the basic scan, we just were able to identify the services that are up. But if we use a different option for Nmap -AT4, we will be able to perform what we call fingerprinting. Fingerprinting would mean determining the actual version of the actual name of the server and the version running on that particular port. So let's say nmap minus 84, and then this is the IP address of our target system. And you will notice that in this detailed output, detailed scan, FTP is using VSFTP 3.0.3. SSH is using this version, and then TCP, Telnet, and DNS. So we have a more detailed view of the target, right? Of the services running on the target. So you can see, for example, the port 80, it was able to get the title, which is the default page for an Ubuntu machine, right? So there. So given this information, you can now look online, right, for vulnerabilities that you can exploit. Let's say, is there a vulnerability for VSFTP 3.0.3? Is there a vulnerability for this version of Apache? Right? So you are interested usually in what you call RCE, remote code execution vulnerabilities, which will allow you to gain shell access on this target machine. Right? So the next one is, okay, so we have more or less identified the target or profiled the target system. Our next step is to use a tool called Metasploit. Metasploit is the tool for a go-to tool for penetration testing, and is already part of the Kali Linux distribution, although you can install it separately. So here are the steps to start Metasploit for doing penetration testing. So first, you need to start Postgres SQL. So from say 127, probably have heard of this. So this is the back end used by Metasploit for storing plugins and other data. So you should be start actually. I stopped it first, and then I started it later, and then we initialize the Metasploit framework database, and it will create a database, right? And then it will start Postgres. So once it's done, right, this is the command to access the console of the Metasploit framework. So MSF console, it will take a while to boot, and then you will have some ASCII art here, and then some information about the current version of Metasploit that I am using. So I am using Kali, and I usually update this every week. So I have the latest version of Metasploit and Kali, because Kali follows a rolling release. Okay, you can just update this upgrade and this upgrade, and once successful, you will be dropped to the MSF6 prompt, which is basically the shell for Metasploit framework. Now, you can use the help command to view the list of commands that can be used inside MSF. Now, for this particular demonstration, we're going to use to exploit a shell shock vulnerability. But before that, we can let me show you how to use the WMAP plugin, which is actually used to perform some initial target enumeration, right? Target discovery, the target machine, specifically for websites or web servers. Right? So this is called the WMAP plugin. So you use the command load WMAP, and once successfully loaded, you can type help, and you will see the list of commands that you can use to perform website scanning or assessments within the Metasploit framework. Although there are tools that can be done that you can use outside of Metasploit. But since we're using Metasploit here, so let's use WMAP. So you have a lot of modules of commands here. Okay. So let's try. So let's try to perform a scan. So let's say you can think of the WMAP plugin as a web scanner. Right? We have tools like W3F. Okay, which is another web scanner. We also have OWASP ZA proxy, also another web scanner. But here we have the web scanner plugin that is built into Metasploit. So here we add a site. So this is our target machine, right? So wmap underscore sites -a. And then we also add the target. Now recall our lab on the shell shock vulnerability, the shell shock lab, right? In that particular lab, I demonstrated CGI bash. Right? So I have, since this is the seed VM, I actually demonstrated that in CGI bash. So we can set a target like this one, and then using the wmap targets, and we can add that as a target, assuming that we know this. This is the vulnerable program actually. So after that, we can look at the modules that can be used by wmap. So like the scanner, so it can scan for HTTP version and other things, other utilities that can be used for performing a web scan. Right? So after that, we use the -e option to actually execute the scan. And when we execute the scan, this is what happens, and it will perform all of the indicated test and scan activities that you included in wmap run -t. Right? So I also put in this picture the side of the target VM. Right? You will notice that while the web scan is being performed, the log files, the Apache log files on the target machine is actually very active. Right? So as you can see, for every request sent by the web scanner, this is actually logged on the Apache log of the target machine. So you can see that this scanner is trying to try different file names or URLs to determine whether there is a target that can be exploited. Right? So it's an important thing to remember that when you perform penetration testing, the defenders on the end, the other side, will actually be receiving alerts of the activities that you're doing. Right? So if an organization has a mature security program, this scanning will give them alerts actually, right? But for some organization who have no idea or have no clue about cybersecurity, they will somehow not get this particular attacks, right? But this is a reminder that whatever you do on a target system, they will be reflected on the logs, right, of the services as shown here. And as you can see, in this particular log entry 10.0.2.5, this means that this request is coming from our tally box, right? So later on, let's say during a forensic analysis, they will be able to identify, this attack came from this particular IP address, and this is the tally box, right? So this is just a side note when doing penetration testing, that logs will actually, or alerts will actually appear on the analyst of the defender side. Okay. So after the completion of the wmap run, okay, run -e, you can use the vulnerabilities discovered, and you can notice that it has discovered a CGI bin directory. Right? So that's just, and also phpMyAdmin directory. So you know that if you have a phpMyAdmin that is publicly accessible, then there are a lot of possibilities that can happen. Okay, but that's just one way of doing a scan on a particular target web scan. Why am I presenting this web scan? Because most initial access actually happen by exploiting vulnerabilities in web applications. Right? For example, if an organization uses WordPress, right, or any other content management system, then it's best to scan these websites, because some of these sites are actually not updated regularly, and there might be old versions of plugins or themes that are vulnerable and can be used as an initial entry to an organization's system, right? So very important web application, right, as an entry point. So, but for this particular walkthrough, I'm going to show you how to exploit the shell shock vulnerability, which is you did manually in the previous lab. Right? This one, we're going to do the exploitation of a shell shock vulnerability using Metasploit, which is somehow an automated process of exploiting this vulnerability. So going back to the prompt of Metasploit, so we can type a search shell shock. So this will actually, the Metasploit framework has a database of vulnerabilities and exploits. So what we did here is to simply search for a shell shock vulnerability that is supported, that can be done within the Metasploit framework. So as you can see, there are a lot of items here, but we are interested in the second item here. Exploit multi-HTTP Apache mod CGI bash env expect, right? Because this one was demonstrated in the shell shock lab, right? So we're going to use this module, not actually module, this module. So this is how to use this module. So use exploit, we simply copy this name here. So use exploit the CGI, the shell shock vulnerability. And then what will happen is that the prompt will change to this one. So MSF6 exploit, the name of the exploit, and then we can use the show info command to study or to review what this particular exploit is all about. So the name is Apache mod CGI bash environment variable code injection or shell shock. The license, the rank, excellent, meaning when you say when the rank is excellent, this means that there is a 100% or 99% guarantee that this exploit will work, and and the date this was added to or disclosed is September 24, 2014, which is actually an old exploit, right? And who is the author of this particular exploit and additional information. So targets will depend on the architecture and the OS, so Linux x86 and Linux x86-64. So you have other information, you can review that. Now, another thing that we can check are the options for this particular exploit, because when we exploit this shell shock vulnerability, we need to provide some options on so that the exploit will work, right? So when you type show options, for example, it will show you the variables that you need to set before you can execute the exploit. So you can see the first column, the name of the variable, then the current setting, is it required? Right, so usually there is a default value for that, right, and some description, right? So this is the exploit, and this is the current. We call this payload, right? Shell code, right, that will be injected on the target process. Command that will be executed on the other end of the process. So recall your shell shock lab, wherein you need to supply a reverse shell, right, using bash. Right? So after this, we can now set the proper or the variables to the correct values for the attack. So first, we have to set the target. Our host is the remote host, right? So we add 10.0.2.15, which is the target VM. And then we also need to add the URI. So notice that this is relative to the host. So CGI-bin, CGI bash, right? And then we show options and we see that our variables are now reflected in the show options. Now, as I said, there is a default payload. Right? The payload is what will get executed on the target machine. And it shows here that it will generate a interpreter, which is a shell that is built into Metasploit, and it will use a reverse TCP. Okay, as you can see here, our host is remote host. L host is local host, meaning this will be the IP address where the listener will receive commands, right? And this is the port number. If you recall the exercise on shell shock, you have to use ncat nc command to start the listener, right? To receive commands from to receive messages from the compromised machine, right? So this is similar, but this is more advanced reverse shell, okay? Because it will run the implementation is Peter, which is a more powerful reverse shell. So once that's done, we can type exploit, then you get a meter shell prompt. When you have this meter shell prompt, this means that you have successfully compromised the machine, right? So because you have this prompt already, so you can now type some commands like pwd, right? So when you type pwd, you will receive the message /user leave CGI bin, which is the current directory where the CGI bash resides. Right? Then you can type ls and you get this information, right? So this is an interesting result, meaning you have successfully accessed the remote system. You have a shell on the remote system, and you can do that if you are not comfortable with interpreter. You can type the shell command here, which will actually invoke a shell prompt on the target machine, right? But you need to do this step, Python -c import pty spawn bin bash. This one will create a pseudo terminal so that you can actually have a prompt similar to a Linux prompt. So after typing this command, you will be transferred to this prompt now, which is very similar to the shell prompt in a typical Linux box, right? And then when I type uname -a, this will show me the kernel information about the target system or the victim. And then we can use the lsb release command to know that we are indeed now inside our target VM, which is 16.04. And then when we type an ID, you will notice that we are www-data. So our initial access by exploiting the shell shock vulnerability via the Metasploit framework is that it gave us access to the target system as user www-data. But in a properly configured system, this www-data has a very limited capability, meaning you can only access information that are related or owned by this particular user. Usually the htdocs directory, right, or the document root directory of the Apache web server. So you can go to the folders, explore the HTML files, explore the PHP files, discover some passwords in the configurations, database configuration, etc. So you have a limited privilege, okay? But the point is we are in now. So that's a success story already. So since you have that particular permission, you can do some exploration of the file system. So you try to find some ways so that you can perform privilege escalation. I'm just an ordinary user of WW data. I have a very limited capability. So one way is to find, for example, this is just a hypothetical scenario. I tried to find a file in /etc that are read write executable by others. Okay? So this permission format here. So after that, executing this command, it returned these items. And one interesting item is shadow.back. Right? Now this shadow.back, right? When I tried this command to show the contents, it's actually a backup of the shadow file. So the shadow file in Linux contains the password of the users. Right? Okay, so that is something interesting. So maybe as the penetration tester, maybe we can crack some of the passwords in this particular shadow.back file. Okay, so how do we crack that? We need another tool called the John the Ripper to be able to crack this password. So next step is to this upper part here. Okay, so we need to download this upper part of the figure here. We need to download shadow.back. Okay, so we use the interpreter shell download /etc shadow.back, and this will be placed on our home directory. And we also downloaded passwd. Okay, so on my other terminal, I just placed I have here the shadow.back and the passwd, and then I use the unshadow command to merge the passwd and the shadow.back file, and then I use the John the Ripper to crack the password, and this is the word file or the word list that I use. And since the password of this user victim is a dictionary word, it was very easy for John the Ripper to crack the password. So you can see there is a user victim who has a password of simple. Right? So that's how easy is that. So what we did here is we're trying to, as the pen tester, we're trying to escalate our privilege. So what we did is we were able to find a backup, a word readable backup file of the shadow file, and we used John the Ripper to crack the password. Right? And unfortunately, the password is simple, so John the Ripper was able to crack that password. So yeah. And then going back to the interpreter shell, created a shell again, and then given that we now have access to credentials, right, victim and simple, we try that, right? So su victim, okay, and then we supply the password, and you will notice the change in the user from www-data to victim, and then this means that the password worked. And then when we type ID, you will notice that this particular user is a sudoer, right? So if this is a sudoer, then we can actually get root access. And this is done by using this command, sudo -s, and you will be prompted with a password. And of course, the password for victim, and we have successfully obtained root on the target system, right? So that's it, right? So the next one is, this one is maintaining access. I mentioned earlier that for some organization, it might not be the case that they will allow you to provide maintain access. So just show us that you can root the box. That's it. Right? But for maintaining access, we can use SSH here. So first I created a key, SSH key. I pressed Control C because I already have a key here. And then I copy that key to the victim account. And then that will be added to the victim's authorized keys. And then I can go back to the target victim without doing the exploitation process again. I can just use a plain SSH access, and I can go to the victim's account without doing the exploitation process again. Right? So this way we have maintained access. Okay. So that's the first part, illustrating how to gain access to the target system. Right? So the next one is penetration testing for web applications, and this one is related to the SQL injection lab. This somehow will automate the process of SQL injection, but I know that you have a separate lab for SQL injection wherein you have to do the exploitation manually. What I'm going to show here is an automated exploitation of SQL injection using the same target that you use in SQL injection lab. So as a preparation, you need, this is my Kali box. I have to add an entry in my host file. So I have to add this entry. Okay, you know this already if you've taken COMSA 137, how to add an entry on the to the host file. So specify the IP address, and this will be the host name or the domain name of this particular machine. Okay. Now to test this, okay, we have this Kali box, and this is I accessed the site, and great, it showed me the actual target web application. Okay. Now the next step is to try to, since we are a penetration tester, we don't know the username and the password, right? So what we can do is to try to put in some values, right? So I tried to put in the username admin and the password, right? So of course it will display an error message, but before I did that, I opened the debugger, okay, the debugger tool, right? And as you can see, this is the request that was sent to the web server when I try to log in with incorrect credentials. So at this point, we might say that, how can I get into the system, right? So fortunately, we have this application has a SQL injection vulnerability. So important to us here is this URL, right? This particular URL. Okay, so this is using a GET request method, and we're going to use that as parameter to the tool that we're going to use, which is called SQL map. So SQL map minus U, and this will be the URL that was this was shown here. Okay. So as you can see, there will be a lot of output trying to SQL map to trying to test whether there is a vulnerability, SQLI vulnerability in this URL. Okay. Take note that you can also use SQL map for post requests, but this here, for simple illustration, we're using a GET request here because this is what is being used by the application. And after a while, it will show some output that will tell you that the parameter username, okay, is vulnerable to SQL injection. And do you want to keep testing the others, if any? So I just selected no. And you will see here the details of how SQL map was able to find the SQLI injection vulnerability, SQL injection vulnerability for this parameter. It says, for example, that username, parameter username, is a blind SQL injection, Boolean based. And then this is the payload that can be used to test that particular, that was used to determine whether that parameter is vulnerable. Okay, so we have other information, but the important thing to remember here is that it's a hit. Right, so we have a vulnerability in the username parameter. Now, how are we going to exploit this vulnerability? Okay, so we're going to use since we are now sure that this particular parameter, this username, is vulnerable, we can use the -- current user parameter of SQL map to determine who the current user is. Right? And as a result of that, it's not shown here, but I think the current user is root. Right? So the current user is root. And then we can also try to pass in the parameter -- current DB, which will show us the result, which is users database. Now, once we know the database, the users database, that the current database is users, we can now check. So we specify minus the users is the database name, and then we try to check the tables inside this particular database users. And we have a table called credential. So we have a database, and we have the database user, and we have the table credential. Then we now have the database, and we have the table. We can dump the columns, show the columns in this particular table, and these are the columns that are available for the credential table. And then lastly, we can dump the contents. Okay? So we know the database users, we know the table name, credentials, and we can specify a set of columns that we would like to display using the dump command. So we want to know the ID, the name, the nickname, the password, the salary, which we were able to identify here in this particular command, SQL map command. And this is the result that we get. So we have the ID, the name, there's no nickname, and we have the password hash, right? It's the password hash, and we have the salary. So very interesting, right? So we did a purely automated way of exfiltrating data from a vulnerable web application using SQL injection. And for example, we can just, let's say we would like to know the password of Alice. We can copy this hash, Google it, and some services have a reverse lookup. And using this particular SHA-1 hash, it will result to recall our discussion about hashing, right? We have a variable length input and we have a fixed length output, and this is irreversible. So the only way to do that is by using a reverse lookup, by maintaining a database of all words, for example, and their corresponding hashes. So this one uses a weak hashing algorithm for SHA-1, and it was able to determine that this hash, which is the password of Alice, is actually Sid Alice, and we can use it to log into the account. You can type here Alice, and then we can type Sid Alice, and we can log into the system, to the web application, right? So that's how easy it is to use SQL map for penetration testing for web applications. Now, in a more recent news, right? So we have this during the election week. There was an arrest of some of. It says here that tatlong inarestong suspect konektado umano sa dating empleyado ng Smartmatic na nasangkot sa umano'y security breach sa kumpanya. Right? So this is one of this screen capture of the video that was presented in this TV Patrol program, and this is one of the displays presented in the report, ABS-CBN report. And you can see here that the hackers, which are actually very young, 18 and 21 years old. As you can see here, you have SQL map, right? So this is how they are doing it when they are when they're doing their activities, their illegal activities, right? So SQL map is a tool. It can be used by legally using via penetration testing, or it can be used illegally, like this one, this hacking group, by breaking into web applications of certain organizations which are vulnerable to all this SQL injection. Okay, so yeah, that's just an aside. So for the resources, we have the following. So you have the book, the Kali Linux, and Kali. We have the web scanner, WMAP. We have Meterpreter if you want to learn more about Meterpreter. Okay, and SQL map. You have AMAS, and this is the full report. If you want to go to review the full report, the hypothetical pen test report from OSSEC. And then we have this methodology from NIST for testing. And then we have exploit DB, which contains a list of exploits, more recent exploits. Right? I would also like to add in this. So here you have exploit database. So once you've identified the target systems, you have identified the ports by your applications, you can search for exploits. For example, if you would like to search for WordPress, so your target is a WordPress site, so you can look at some of the plugins. Okay, so you have a more recent plugin here, and you can just authenticate. It means that you have to be logged into a WordPress site, and then you can use this code, and usually have a proof of concept code here. And of course, our favorite tool for SQL injection, automated SQL injection exploitation is SQL map here, as shown here in this example, right? So you can use that exploit DB. Now, another tool, if you want another cool site where you can try to practice penetration testing, is called VulnHub, right? So VulnHub is a site with a collection of machines that you can try to perform penetration testing on legally, because these are VMs, right? So there is no problem. You have to set up your own lab and try to practice on this virtual machine. So you can submit your own if you have prepared a machine. You can try this for some practice pen testing. And of course, we have the Hack the Box, right? So Hack the Box is another way to practice pen testing. Okay, so you will be connected to VPN in the Hack the Box platform, and then you get to exploit. You get the chance to perform pen tests on the machines available in the Hack the Box platform. Okay, so that ends our discussion on penetration testing, right? So for your lab, you have 2 VMs. I uploaded 2 VMs in the Google Classroom, and you need to perform penetration testing on these machines, at least be able to have a remote shell access on the target machine, and if possible, you can do some privilege escalation activities if you are not able to compromise the root account on the VMs that I provided for this lab. Okay, so that will be all for today's discussion on penetration testing. So I hope you learned something from this video. Okay, so do you have some questions, Jared?